In August 1914, Europe lurched into a shock unlike anything seen in modern history. After decades of simmering resentment, arms races, and rival alliances, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo ignited the First World War. Within weeks, the great powers of the continent were drawn into a vortex of total war. For France and the German Empire, this was more than a clash of alliances. It was the resurfacing of a bitter historical rivalry dating back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. A wound that had never fully healed in the collective memory of either nation. France entered the war haunted by the trauma of 1871 and the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. For more than 4 decades, the spirit of revanche had shaped French military and political thought. The French General Staff believed that national honor could only be restored through a decisive, unrelenting offensive at the war's outset. This conviction was embodied in Plan 17, a military doctrine centered on the offensive, elevating willpower and infantry courage as the decisive tools for smashing the enemy's lines. Under Plan 17, the French armies were to push aggressively along the eastern and northeastern borders, especially into Alsace-Lorraine and the regions bordering Germany and Luxembourg. French High Command believed that seizing the initiative and hurling the Germans back into their own territory would unravel Berlin's strategic planning. Yet this unwavering fixation on offensive spirit led to serious misjudgments about terrain, enemy strength, and the nature of industrialized warfare. The Ardennes region, stretching across northeastern France, southern Belgium, and Luxembourg, was regarded by the French command as a secondary axis. Its dense forests, rugged hills, narrow valleys, and limited roads seemed unsuitable for the large-scale operations of a modern army. French commanders widely believed that heavy artillery and mobile logistics could not be deployed effectively there. As a result, the Ardennes was treated as a natural buffer, requiring only minimal defensive and reconnaissance forces. Germany, however, approached the war with a fundamentally different mindset. The Schlieffen Plan, crafted long before hostilities began, was a cold mathematical strategy designed to avoid a prolonged two-front war. Its central feature was a massive right wing that would sweep through Belgium and northern France, swing south, and defeat the French army in a rapid campaign before turning east against Russia. Yet to protect this great flanking movement, Germany still had to deploy substantial forces in regions like the Ardennes and Lorraine. For the German General Staff, the Ardennes was not the main axis of advance, but it could not be left exposed. They understood that if the French launched an offensive through the region, a major clash could erupt with profound consequences for the entire campaign. Thus, the German 4th and 5th Armies were ordered to move through the Ardennes, screening the flank while preparing to repel any French attack. But even the Germans did not anticipate the scale of the collision that was about to unfold there. The Ardennes was a harsh, shadowed landscape, almost purpose-built for ambush and confusion. Dense forests blotted out the sky, morning fog thickened across the valleys, and visibility dropped sharply. Narrow, winding roads slowed movement and made marching hazardous. In such terrain, gunfire echoed unpredictably, creating the unsettling sense that the enemy could emerge from any direction. For the ordinary soldier, the Ardennes offered none of the heroic imagery of sweeping open fields. It was a lethal maze where fear and disorientation stalked every step. In mid-August 1914, France's Third Army under General Pierre Ruffy and Fourth Army under General Fernand de Langle de Carry advanced into the Ardennes, convinced they would encounter only weak and scattered German formations. At the same time, Germany's 4th and 5th Armies moved through the region in the opposite direction, tasked with shielding the flank of the main offensive and ready to confront the French if necessary. 2 massive armies, each believing it held the advantage, unknowingly marched straight toward one another in the fog-bound forest. Neither side had prepared for a major battle in the Ardennes. Initial plans quickly became obsolete as the brutal complexity of the terrain asserted itself. In choking mist and dense undergrowth, infantry units stumbled into close-range encounters where every theory of warfare was tested mercilessly. The Ardennes, dismissed at first as a minor sector, was suddenly transformed into one of the bloodiest and most tragic battlefields of the war's opening phase. A place where both armies collided not with flawless strategy, but with confusion, bloodshed, and the unforgiving realities of modern war. As the Ardennes campaign began to take shape in mid-August 1914, both the French and German armies entered the dense forest with different strategic expectations but shared one dangerous flaw. Neither side fully grasped the scale or brutality of the clash that was about to unfold. The Ardennes was not considered a decisive battlefield in either side's initial planning, and this very assumption ensured that both armies marched into the region with uneven preparation, laying the groundwork for a violent and chaotic confrontation. On the French side, two major forces were committed: the Third Army and the Fourth Army, under the overall command of General Joseph Joffre. The Third Army, led by General Pierre Ruffy, was commanded by an experienced staff officer known for his organizational ability. The Fourth Army, under General Fernand de Langlais de Carry, was directed by a cautious commander with long experience in colonial campaigns and a reputation for discipline. Together, these two armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Composed of infantry, cavalry, and artillery corps stretched across the rugged forests and valleys of the Ardennes. The French infantry, the core of the army, had been trained according to the aggressive spirit of Plan 17. French soldiers marched into war believing that willpower, courage, and rapid assaults would overwhelm the enemy. They carried the Lebel 1886 rifle, accurate at long range, and the long bayonet that symbolized France's emphasis on close-quarters shock action. French artillery relied heavily on the famous 75mm field gun, fast-firing and highly mobile, but critically lacked heavy artillery and machine guns compared to the Germans. One major weakness in French preparation was reconnaissance and situational awareness. The forested terrain made cavalry scouting ineffective, and communications were limited. Orders and reports were often delayed or distorted as they moved through dense woods and steep terrain. The traditional blue and red French uniforms, while symbolically powerful, became a severe liability in modern warfare, making soldiers easy targets in sparse woods and on open slopes. Operationally, French high command believed that German forces in the Ardennes were weak, assigned only to guard the flank of the main German advance. This assumption led to deployments oriented toward attack rather than defense in depth. French armies were ordered to advance rapidly, seek contact, and seize the initiative through frontal assaults. Contingency plans for encountering strong, well-organized German forces were insufficient, leaving French troops vulnerable the moment reality diverged from expectations. Opposing them, the German Fourth and Fifth Armies entered the Ardennes to protect the flank of the Schlieffen Plan's massive right wing. The Fourth Army was commanded by Duke Albrecht of Württemberg, while the Fifth Army was led by Crown Prince Wilhelm, son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Though not assigned to the principal offensive axis, these armies were well supplied, substantial in number, and fully capable of repelling any French thrust. The Germans approached the Ardennes with greater caution and realism. German infantry were equipped with the Mauser-Gewehr 98 rifle and a far higher density of Maxim MG-08 machine guns than the French. Their artillery arm included both field guns and a notable complement of heavy guns. Although not deployed as massively as during the reduction of Belgian fortresses, this heavy artillery still granted Germany a clear firepower advantage at medium and long ranges. German units were thoroughly trained in combined arms cooperation: infantry, artillery, and machine guns, allowing them to react flexibly to sudden encounters. German command and communication systems also proved more effective under difficult conditions. Orders were relayed clearly, and lower-level commanders were granted meaningful autonomy. Reconnaissance, despite the fog and forest, was more systematically organized through a combination of cavalry, forward infantry detachments, and rapidly processed intelligence reports. This enabled German headquarters to recognize early on that they were facing major French armies, not the weak screening forces some had initially assumed. Even so, the Germans were not fully prepared for a pitched battle in the Ardennes. Their original mission was to advance cautiously, guard the flank, and maintain alignment with neighboring armies. The fact that both sides simultaneously pushed deep into the forest rapidly upended these plans. Columns trained for orderly advance or controlled defense soon had to transition abruptly into combat formations, with incomplete information and little visibility. Both armies entered the Ardennes with a dangerous degree of overconfidence. The French believed they would overwhelm the enemy with spirit and speed. The Germans believed they could easily blunt French attacks in terrain that disadvantaged the attacker. The battlefield was about to prove both assumptions wrong. The Ardennes, shrouded in thick mist and suffocating terrain, favored neither doctrine nor calculation. It stripped away the advantages of offensive elan and strategic planning alike, forcing soldiers on both sides into sudden, bloody encounters at close range. As the armies completed their deployments and advanced deeper into the forest, the atmosphere of war grew heavy and foreboding. Long columns of troops stretched along narrow woodland roads, artillery struggled forward through steep valleys, steady footsteps echoed through the morning fog. None of the soldiers marching into the Ardennes knew they were heading toward one of the most confused, chaotic, and tragic battles of the war's opening phase. A place where every form of preparation, whether grounded in doctrine or forged in iron discipline, was about to be pushed to its absolute limit. Beginning on August 20th, 1914, as the French armies pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the opening phase of the battle unfolded amid an atmosphere of fog, tension, and confusion. Unlike the wide, open fronts with clear lines of deployment, the Ardennes greeted soldiers on both sides with thick mist, dense forests, and narrow roads winding through hills and valleys. In such conditions, operational plans drawn neatly on maps quickly lost their accuracy, and war took the form of sudden, violent, and almost unanticipated encounters. On the French side, General Pierre Ruffy's Third Army and General Fernand de Langlais de Cary's Fourth Army advanced with a strong offensive spirit. Acting under orders from French High Command, the units were instructed to move rapidly, seek out and destroy what was believed to be thinly deployed German forces in the region. French infantry columns marched through the morning fog along forest paths and narrow valleys, convinced they were seizing the initiative. Yet from the earliest hours, the consequences of inadequate reconnaissance began to reveal themselves. The first clashes erupted when French advance units unexpectedly collided with German formations marching in the opposite direction. In the mist and dense woodland, the distance between the armies shrank to mere dozens of meters, sometimes less. Infantry units nearly stumbled into each other on forest tracks, with the first shots fired in shock and chaos. With no time to deploy properly or bring up supporting artillery, many engagements devolved into close-range firefights, where bayonets, rifles, and machine guns determined life and death moment by moment. True to their offensive doctrine, the French quickly launched assaults in an effort to push the enemy back. Infantry regiments advanced across patches of open woodland and clearings, led by officers in regimental colors. But the terrain of the Ardennes made broad, sweeping attacks nearly impossible. German machine guns positioned on high ground, key trails, and forest edges opened fire with devastating effect, cutting down advancing French lines. Within minutes, several French units suffered heavy casualties and were forced to halt or retreat in disarray. On the German side, the Fourth and Fifth Armies had also underestimated the scale of the French advance. However, their superior firepower and organization allowed them to transition quickly from marching to battle formation. German artillery, though hampered by limited visibility, began firing suppression barrages toward suspected French positions. Shells exploded across the forest, shaking the ground and striking fear into French troops advancing without fortified shelter. Thus, the opening stage of the Battle of the Ardennes took shape as a series of scattered but extremely bloody engagements. There was no continuous front, no clearly defined battle line. Instead, the battlefield consisted of dozens, even hundreds, of small points of contact where battalions and companies were left to fend for themselves amid fragmented communication and incomplete orders. Many French units received no updated instructions for hours, forcing junior officers to decide whether to press forward or hold based solely on their judgment. For soldiers on both sides, the early fighting was overwhelming and terrifying. French troops, expecting only light resistance, found themselves up against a well-organized enemy with strong firepower and a willingness to counterattack. Anxiety spread as assaults were stopped cold, and comrades fell in the forest without even seeing who had fired the fatal shots. German soldiers, meanwhile, battled under extreme tension, knowing that French attacks could come from any direction at alarmingly close range. Terrain played a decisive role in shaping the battle. The Ardennes forest negated the effectiveness of large formations and shattered the possibility of centralized command. Narrow roads slowed artillery and supply movements, creating dangerous bottlenecks. morning fog reduced visibility, causing unexpected encounters to erupt repeatedly. In these conditions, France's numerical advantage could not be fully exploited, while Germany's superior firepower was only partially effective, yet still deadly enough to create decisive imbalances at key moments. On August 20th and 21st, the intensity of combat escalated across the entire region. French thrusts repeatedly struck strong German resistance, while German forces began organizing counterattacks to drive the French from key positions. Villages, crossroads, and forest clearings became fierce battlegrounds. Houses were destroyed, trees splintered by artillery, and the forest floor soon lay strewn with bodies and abandoned equipment. Though the French retained strong fighting spirit, they increasingly confronted the gap between theory and the harsh reality of modern war. Attacks without adequate artillery support resulted in mounting casualties. Poor coordination left many French units isolated, their assaults broken apart one by one. Meanwhile, German forces gradually seized the initiative, not through sweeping maneuvers, but by dismantling French attacks piece by piece within the forest. The opening phase of the Battle of the Ardennes thus ended in a tense stalemate. Neither side achieved an immediate decisive victory, but the first signs were unmistakable. The French advance was beginning to falter under German firepower and discipline, while the Germans realized they were facing a much larger and more determined French force than expected. In the fog and ceaseless gunfire, the Ardennes became a place where both sides' initial illusions were swallowed whole, setting the stage for an even more violent crescendo, where confusion would give way to life-or-death decisions for tens of thousands of soldiers. As the Battle of the Ardennes surged into its climax on August 21st and 22nd, 1914, the dense forests and fog-filled valleys of the region transformed into a chaotic, blood-soaked battlefield. Here, the major French and German armies collided head-on in some of the worst conditions modern warfare could produce. The climax was not a single decisive blow, but a relentless accumulation of fierce engagements in which every regiment and battalion fought for survival within a fragmented, disordered, and nearly uncontrollable landscape. On the French side, the 3rd and 4th Armies continued to press their attacks despite heavy losses in the opening phase. French high command still believed that offensive spirit and unyielding pressure would force the Germans to withdraw from the Ardennes. In reality, this meant that many French units were driven into frontal assaults across terrain that overwhelmingly favored the defender. French infantry advanced through sparse woods, narrow valleys, and open hillsides, only to be met by German machine gun and artillery fire at deadly ranges. The pinnacle of the fighting was most evident in the brutal struggles for villages and key forest crossroads. Places such as Neufchâteau, Virton, Rossignol, and the surrounding areas became epicenters of ferocious combat. In many cases, French units entered villages through morning fog believing the enemy had retreated, only to be met by sudden bursts of German machine gun fire from concealed positions in houses, forest edges, and high ground. These clashes quickly devolved into close-quarters combat, where bayonets, rifles, and grenades decided individual fates. The Germans, recovering from their initial surprise, organized their defenses and counterattacks with increasing effectiveness. The 4th and 5th Armies made full use of superior firepower and tight discipline. Maxim MG-08 machine guns were positioned along key approaches, forest paths, and village outskirts, forming nearly impenetrable walls of fire. German artillery, though hampered by fog and forest cover, still managed to lay down suppressive barrages on areas where French troops were concentrated, shattering attack formations before they could reach defensive lines. At the height of the battle, chaos reached its peak. French and German units frequently became intermingled in the woods, leading to sudden firefights at distances of only a few meters. Gunshots echoed from all directions, amplified by trees and valleys, making it nearly impossible for officers to determine where to advance or defend. Many junior officers were wounded or killed, leaving soldiers to make life-or-death decisions on their own under extreme stress. For French soldiers, the climax of the Ardennes battle marked the painful collapse of their early war illusions. They had believed that spirit and courage could compensate for every shortfall, but the battlefield revealed the opposite. Assault after assault was shattered. Comrades fell in the forest without ever seeing the enemy. Many units were devastated within hours, their morale eroded by exhaustion, confusion, and the terrifying sense of being surrounded by unseen foes. For the Germans, although they held the initiative, the cost was high. They fought continuously in harsh conditions with limited visibility, always at risk of sudden French attacks from multiple directions. Counterattacks in the forest often occurred at extremely close range, where even German firepower could not always dominate. German soldiers, though well-trained, still faced primal fear as they fought in thick fog, where death could emerge from a fleeting silhouette between the trees. One of the defining features of the battle's climax was the gradual breakdown of centralized command on both sides, though the effect was far worse for the French. Communication lines were severed. Orders from above arrived too late or no longer matched battlefield reality. This left many French attacks isolated and vulnerable, each one crushed in turn by German countermeasures. Meanwhile, the Germans, benefiting from a more flexible command system, steadily adjusted their formations and shifted from passive defense to controlled counterattacks. The Ardennes landscape revealed its full cruelty during these hours. The forest not only hid enemies, it hid the wounded. Many lay among the undergrowth and ravines, unable to be evacuated in time. Cries for help mingled with gunfire before fading into silence. Forest roads became grim pathways marked by exhausted marching columns, abandoned weapons, and the scattered bodies of fallen soldiers. By the end of August 22, the climax of the Ardennes battle had left an indelible mark. The French armies had failed to achieve the breakthrough they hoped for, while the Germans had successfully halted and broken much of the French offensive. Though not yet a decisive, annihilating victory, the balance of the battlefield had shifted unmistakably. The ferocity of these days was measured not only in casualties, but also in a profound shift in how both sides understood modern war. In the fog and fire of the Ardennes, the conflict demonstrated that modern warfare had no mercy for illusions, and that the fate of tens of thousands could be decided in just a few days of chaotic struggle deep within the forest. As the fierce fighting in the Ardennes gradually subsided late on August 22nd and into the early hours of August 23rd, 1914, the battlefield revealed a bleak and suffocating scene of devastation. Fog still clung to the valleys and hillsides, but now it mixed with the smoke of gunpowder, the scent of churned, damp earth, and the bodies strewn among shattered tree trunks. The Battle of the Ardennes did not end with a symbolic, resounding victory. Instead, it concluded with the strategic collapse of early hopes, particularly for the French, whose armies had entered the forest believing they could overwhelm the enemy through spirit and speed. Militarily, the outcome was a clear defeat for France's Third and Fourth Armies. Their repeated offensives failed to achieve any of their objectives, while they suffered heavy losses under superior German firepower and organization. Each French thrust was broken piecemeal. Many units were driven back in disorder, forcing French high command to accept that the Ardennes could not be pierced through direct assaults as originally envisioned. The failure to secure any meaningful tactical success in the region doomed the entire French central offensive. On the German side, the Fourth and Fifth Armies fulfilled their strategic mission. They not only halted the French attacks, but inflicted severe casualties, thereby ensuring the security of the left flank of Germany's powerful right wing, which was driving rapidly through Belgium and northern France. Although they did not annihilate the French armies outright, the Germans achieved a decisive positional victory, compelling the French to abandon their offensive aspirations and shift into a defensive posture in the days that followed. The casualties from the battle reflected the brutality of combat in unforgiving terrain and harsh weather. The French suffered devastating losses, tens of thousands killed, wounded, or missing in just a few days. Many regiments were reduced to fragments, no longer able to function as effective fighting units, and had to withdraw for reorganization. These numbers were not mere statistics. They represented the loss of an entire generation of young Frenchmen who had marched into war with fierce conviction, only to be confronted with the merciless reality of industrial firepower. The Germans also paid a significant price. Close-range fighting in dense forest inflicted high casualties, especially during counterattacks and in defensive actions against desperate French assaults. Yet unlike the French, German losses occurred within the context of a strategically successful campaign. Their formations held together. Their command structure remained functional. and they continued advancing within the broader framework of the Schlieffen Plan, something the French could not do after the Ardennes. Psychologically, the battle was a profound shock for France's army and society. It ruthlessly exposed the fatal weaknesses of an offensive doctrine grounded in spirit but lacking the firepower, reconnaissance, and depth of defense required for modern war. Survivors left the Ardennes carrying haunting memories of shattered assaults, of comrades dying unseen in the fog, of the crushing realization that bravery could not substitute for heavy artillery and machine guns. The battlefield had delivered a merciless verdict. For French High Command, the Ardennes served as a bitter warning. Combined with other defeats in the battles of the frontiers, it forced a re-evaluation of the entire French military mindset. Though change would not come overnight, recognition of the indispensable role of artillery, fortifications, and defense in depth began to take root. The Ardennes became one of the first unmistakable proofs that 20th century war was no longer the stage for romantic charges, but a cold confrontation between highly organized, heavily armed war machines. For Germany, victory in the Ardennes reinforced early confidence that their strategy was working. Securing the flank and weakening the French Central Armies created favorable conditions for the continued advance of the German right wing. Yet the battle also revealed that even exceptionally well-organized forces could suffer heavily when fighting in hostile terrain. The Ardennes was no easy triumph. It was a stark reminder that the war would not be the swift campaign many had imagined. In historical perspective, the 1914 Ardennes battle holds a significant place in the opening phase of the First World War. It was a key component of the battles of the frontiers, where the French army repeatedly collided with the full strength of German organization and firepower. The defeat contributed directly to the Great Retreat of French and British forces, setting the stage for the events that would culminate in the Battle of the Marne. Though less celebrated than more decisive engagements, the Ardennes was where the strategic fate of the Western Front began to take shape. Seen from the distance of history, the Ardennes stands as a collective tragedy. In its fog-shrouded woods, tens of thousands fought, fell, and vanished among nameless trees, not because of personal failures, but because of doctrines and decisions made far behind the lines. The outcome of the battle is recorded not only in maps and reports, but in blood, in the silence of the forest, and in the enduring memory it impressed upon the history of the First World War, a solemn warning of the true cost of modern war. The Battle of the Ardennes, in 1914, ended in fog, blood, and the heavy silence of the deep forest. Yet its echoes lingered long in the history of the First World War. A region once considered secondary, the Ardennes became the battlefield that laid bare the collision between doctrine, reality, and human fate. The blind, uncertain marches, the close-quarters encounters, and the shattered infantry charges left painful lessons for both sides, especially for France in the opening days of a global conflict. How do you feel about the Battle of the Ardennes and the tragic chaos that unfolded within that mist-shrouded forest? What haunts you most? The initial overconfidence of the commanders, or the terror faced by soldiers as they stumbled into their enemies in near-blind conditions? If you found this story meaningful and rich in historical insight, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and following the channel as we continue to explore the brutal battles that shaped the First World War and the course of world history.